Welcome to Darkverse, where the shadows of the road meet the chilling tales that haunt the highways. I'm Isaac Nightshade, your guide through the eerie, the inexplicable, and the terrifying realities that lie just beyond the familiar. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me down dark and twisted roads where reality and nightmare often blur. These are not just tales from the fringes. They are real-life highway horror stories, stories that defy explanation, leaving behind a trail of mystery and terror. From vanishing hitchhikers to cryptic encounters, these tales will make you question your safety the next time you take a late-night drive. So buckle up, turn down the lights, and listen closely. If you find yourself hooked by the unknown and the unsettling, consider subscribing and joining me on this spine-chilling adventure through Darkverse. Let the terror of the open road begin. Story 1. The Haunted Hitchhiker. It was a cold evening in October when Richard found himself behind the wheel of his car, the engine humming softly as it cut through the dense darkness of rural Texas. The headlights illuminated a long stretch of road ahead of him, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly with no end in sight. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the road, the occasional hiss of the windshield wipers, and the wind brushing against the car's body were the only noises that filled the otherwise suffocating silence. Richard had been driving for hours, alone, after finishing up some business in Dallas. It was supposed to be a routine drive back to his home in Houston, a long but familiar journey on the empty highways. The clock on his dashboard flashed 11:37 p.m. He rubbed his tired eyes and yawned, realizing how drained he felt. The drive had already taken longer than expected, and the quiet solitude of the highway was starting to weigh on him. He longed to be home, with the comfort of his bed, and the thought of the long night ahead seemed almost unbearable. That was when he saw her. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, only a shadow in the distance. He squinted through the windshield, his eyes adjusting to the low light. Standing on the shoulder of the road was a woman. She was tall, thin, and her face was obscured by the hood of a large dark coat. Richard's heart skipped a beat. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, at such a late hour. Richard had always been taught to avoid picking up hitchhikers. It was something ingrained in him from a young age, especially on isolated stretches of road like this. But something about her made him hesitate. Her body language wasn't threatening. She wasn't waving her arms around frantically or acting erratically. She simply stood there, almost waiting, as if she had been waiting for him all along. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he found himself slowing down, the car creeping closer to the figure by the roadside. His thumb hovered over the window button, ready to roll it down. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice a little shakier than he'd expected. The woman slowly turned her head toward him. Richard could barely make out her features, but her eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, almost unnaturally bright. She nodded faintly, a movement so subtle it could have been missed if he hadn't been looking so intently. "I'm just trying to get to the next town," she said, her voice soft and calm, yet carrying a strange weight to it, like she was speaking through a veil of exhaustion. Richard paused, his mind racing. There were no towns for miles, not for another hour at least. She would likely be stranded out there in the cold if he didn't offer her a ride. "I'm headed that way," he said, finally unlocking the passenger door. "Get in, I'll take you there." She didn't say a word, but her gaze never left him. She simply opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, a faint scent of mildew clinging to her, mixing with the stale air in the car. Richard tried to shake off the unease settling in his chest. After all, he was just doing a good deed. But he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut as she buckled her seatbelt, sitting eerily still. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the car cutting through the stillness of the night. Richard stole occasional glances at her, but each time he looked over, she was staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So where are you from?" Richard asked, trying to break the silence. Though he had no real interest in small talk, he needed something to distract him from the odd feeling that was starting to crawl up his spine. "Not too far," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Just passing through." Passing through, he thought. There was no town for miles. The nearest city was hours away, and there were no real highways connecting this desolate stretch of land to anything. His confusion deepened. They continued driving, but the silence between them only grew heavier. Richard's mind began to wander. The longer he looked at her, the more uncomfortable he became. There was something in her eyes, something haunting, something distant, that unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. Her skin was pale, and the darkness seemed to cling to her, as if she were part of it. He shook the thought away, blaming his exhaustion. Suddenly, the woman spoke again, her voice a soft whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're being followed?" she asked. Richard froze, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The words felt like an ice-cold chill creeping into his bones. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his voice was shaky, betraying his growing fear. She didn't respond at first, just stared out the window, her face expressionless. Then her lips parted again, barely moving as she spoke. "You can feel it, can't you?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind rushing past the windows. "Like there's something behind you, even when you know. There's nothing there." Richard's heart raced. He tried to focus on the road, to ignore the feeling creeping up on him. This wasn't normal. There was something wrong here, something that didn't sit right in his gut. But before he could respond, the woman spoke again. "You're not alone out here," she whispered, almost like she was speaking to herself. "You never were." Richard's breath caught in his throat, and he forced his eyes to stay on the road. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. It was then that he realized the air had grown heavy, dense, like the very atmosphere was suffocating him. The temperature inside the car dropped, and he could see his breath fogging up the windshield, though the car's heater was running. He couldn't explain it. Without warning, the woman turned to him, her gaze locking onto his. Her eyes, once glowing faintly in the dark, were now completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire iris, black as night, unblinking and unfeeling. Richard's hands shook as he slammed his foot on the gas, accelerating faster than he ever had before. The woman didn't react. She just stared at him, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The miles seemed to stretch on forever as Richard drove faster, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in. But no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from behind, something unseen. He glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, he thought he saw something moving, something large and dark, just out of sight. He could hear her voice again, soft but insistent. "Don't stop." Before Richard could respond, he noticed the headlights of another vehicle in the distance. His heart skipped a beat, and for the first time, he dared to look away from the road. When he turned back, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there. Richard slammed on the brakes, heart pounding in his chest, his body drenched in sweat. He glanced around in a panic, but there was nothing. No sign of the woman, no sign of anyone. The road was empty once more. He didn't stop. He didn't dare. Hours later, Richard arrived at the nearest town, the unsettling feeling still lingering in his bones. His hands trembled as he pulled into a gas station and stepped out of the car. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but it did nothing to cool the fear inside him. He leaned against his car, trying to catch his breath. He noticed something then. On the passenger seat of his car, something was there. It was a small, folded piece of paper. Richard picked it up, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. The words were simple, written in dark, thick ink. "I told you, they follow you." Story 2. The Midnight Detour. It was nearly 1:30 a.m. when Amanda found herself on an unfamiliar stretch of highway, her car's headlights cutting through the thick blackness that surrounded her. The radio crackled with static, and the only sound was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. Amanda was exhausted. She'd spent the past few days visiting a friend in Phoenix and had planned on getting home to Los Angeles before the sun rose. However, a series of delays had pushed her departure later than expected, and now she was driving through the lonely desert, far from the nearest city. Her GPS had guided her this far, but now it seemed to have stopped working. The screen froze, leaving her with no clue about where she was headed. "Great," Amanda muttered under her breath. The eerie quiet of the night seemed to press down on her, the vast emptiness of the desert offering no comfort. There was no cell signal either. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the road ahead seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if it were leading nowhere. After a while, she realized that fatigue was starting to take its toll on her. Her eyes felt heavy, and her mind kept wandering. She had driven through so many stretches of desert, and each one looked identical, barren and lifeless. She had been driving through a part of Arizona known for being desolate and isolated. It was the kind of place where you could drive for miles without passing another car or seeing a single light. "Okay, Amanda," she said aloud, trying to snap herself out of her tired stupor. "Just get to the next exit and you can rest for a bit. You're almost there." But then, without warning, her car sputtered. The engine hiccuped and gave a violent shake. Amanda's heart raced as the steering wheel jerked in her hands. "No, no, no," she whispered, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. But nothing worked. The car slowed to a crawl and then came to a complete stop. The engine was dead. Amanda cursed under her breath. She tried to restart the car, but it wasn't budging. Her mind raced. She could feel the weight of isolation creeping in as the empty road stretched out before her. No lights, no signs of life. Just miles and miles of desolate land. She checked her phone, but there was no signal. She looked around, hoping for any sign of civilization, but the night was silent. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her purse and grabbed a flashlight, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll just check the engine. Maybe it's something simple," she said, trying to calm herself. As Amanda stepped out of the car, a sudden chill hit her. The air felt colder than it should have been for the desert, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She flicked on the flashlight and shone it around, scanning the dark horizon. But there was nothing, just sand and rocks stretching on forever. She knelt by the front of the car, trying to open the hood, but as her fingers touched the cold metal, she heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible over the wind, a noise that made her blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt. Amanda froze. She stood up, the flashlight shaking in her hand. She turned around slowly, but saw nothing. Just the desert, silent and still. Her heart raced in her chest as she strained her ears, but the footsteps stopped as quickly as they had started. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. There was no answer, but the feeling of being watched hung in the air like a thick fog. Her pulse quickened, and she hurried back to the car, fumbling with the door handle as she tried to get back inside. As she climbed into the driver's seat, her flashlight beam fell upon something on the passenger seat, a figure standing just behind her car, barely visible in the darkness. Amanda's blood ran cold. The figure was tall, wearing a long, dark coat, but there was something strange about it. The way the figure stood perfectly still, unmoving. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she felt the familiar sensation of dread crawl up her spine. She slammed the car door shut, locked it, and turned the ignition key, praying the car would start. It didn't. Panicking, she turned it again, this time a little harder. The engine sputtered to life, and Amanda almost cried in relief. She threw the car in reverse and sped down the road, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw the figure again, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road, watching her. But this time, something was different. The figure had come closer, much closer. In fact, it seemed like it had moved faster than any person should have been able to. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as she floored the gas pedal, not daring to look back again. She kept driving, faster and faster, her eyes scanning the dark road ahead, trying not to lose focus. She drove for what felt like hours, her hands trembling, and her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the headlights of another car appeared in the distance. Amanda's heart leaped with relief. She slowed down, relieved to see someone else on the road. As she passed the car, she tried to wave, desperate for some sign of safety. But the car didn't slow down. It just kept going, driving straight ahead into the dark. And then, as if on cue, Amanda's engine sputtered again. Her heart dropped to her stomach as she realized she was about to be stranded again. This time, with no sign of anyone around. Her hands shook as she turned the key, but nothing happened. The car was dead, and she was alone once again. And then, from the darkness, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps once more. Amanda slammed her palms against the steering wheel, eyes wide with terror. She could feel it now, the presence of something she couldn't see but could feel standing behind her, watching her. Suddenly, the sound stopped. She turned to look, and there, standing just outside her window, was a figure, a man, tall, gaunt, his face partially obscured by the darkness. He didn't say a word, just stared at her with eyes that seemed to burn through her, hollow and empty. In a panic, Amanda unlocked the door and swung it open. She ran. She ran through the desert in complete darkness, not knowing which direction she was heading, but knowing that she couldn't stay in the car anymore. She ran until she collapsed, gasping for breath, and the last thing she saw before everything went black was a flash of headlights. Story 3. The Vanishing Driver. It was nearing 2 a.m. when Ethan found himself traveling down Interstate 40, heading west toward Albuquerque. He had been on the road for hours, his tired eyes barely staying open as he drove through the empty stretch of Oklahoma. The monotony of highway driving had begun to take its toll on him. He had left Memphis earlier that evening, hoping to make it home in time for an early morning meeting. But now every mile seemed to drag on longer than the last, and his eyelids were growing heavier by the second. Ethan had always enjoyed long drives, the open road, and the solitude it brought. But this particular night felt different. The air outside had grown cold, and there was a strange stillness to the night. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional flicker of the radio static. He had tried calling his friend Mark earlier, but the connection had dropped, leaving him with nothing but silence for company. The headlights of his car cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. Ethan squinted into the night, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning the road for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just miles and miles of empty flat land. The clock on the dashboard read 1:45 a.m. His body ached with exhaustion, and he fought to keep his focus. That's when he saw it. Up ahead, he noticed a car pulled over to the side of the road. At first, it looked like a breakdown, just another unfortunate traveler stranded in the middle of nowhere. But as Ethan got closer, he saw that the car was unusual. It was an old sedan, one that looked out of place on a modern highway. The headlights were off, and there was no sign of any hazard lights. The car just sat there, as if waiting for something. Curiosity got the best of him. He slowed down as he passed the vehicle, craning his neck to get a better look. It was a black sedan, and sitting in the driver's seat was a figure, just barely visible in the dim light. The person didn't move, just stared ahead through the windshield, unmoving. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the scene felt off, too still, too quiet. But he couldn't shake the urge to stop and help. Maybe the person was stranded. Maybe they needed assistance. It wasn't too uncommon for people to be stuck on the side of the road out there. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw no other cars in sight, just the desolate emptiness behind him. His eyes moved back to the car on the side of the road, and he made a snap decision. He pulled over in front of the sedan, his car's tires grinding on the pavement as he came to a stop. He put the car in park, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the cold night. The air had a bite to it, and it sent a shiver up his spine as he walked toward the other car. "Hey, you all right?" Ethan called out as he approached the driver's side window. There was no reply. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Ethan tapped on the window, but the figure still remained, motionless. The eerie silence hung heavy in the air. He tried again, knocking a little louder this time. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, feeling a bit unnerved now. It was then that the figure finally moved, very slowly, almost unnaturally. The person turned their head toward Ethan, but their eyes were glazed, vacant, like they weren't fully aware of his presence. Ethan's stomach churned, and a feeling of unease washed over him. Before he could ask anything else, the figure's mouth slowly opened, and a voice barely above a whisper came from within the car. "Leave, now." The words were so soft, so chilling, that they sent a shiver crawling up Ethan's spine. It wasn't a warning, but more of an order. He could feel his pulse quicken, his heart hammering in his chest. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the person had spoken, as though they were trapped in time, unable to leave. "Are you sure you're okay?" Ethan asked, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. His instincts were telling him to leave, but he couldn't quite bring himself to do so. The dread in the air made him feel like he was stuck in place. The figure's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it wasn't a comforting one. It was the kind of smile that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. "Go, before it's too late," the voice whispered, more insistent this time. Something clicked in Ethan's mind. Something wasn't right here. It was as if this whole encounter was some kind of warning, and the figure in the car wasn't human anymore. There was an unnatural coldness in their voice, in the way their eyes glinted. He couldn't explain it, but the sensation of being watched, of being judged, overwhelmed him. Without another word, he turned around and rushed back to his car, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got inside, he fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He didn't look back. The car roared to life, and Ethan slammed his foot on the gas pedal, sending the vehicle speeding down the road. His breath came in short bursts as he glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the sedan standing there, watching him leave. But the road behind him was empty, nothing but darkness. As he drove, the strange feeling of being pursued lingered, creeping in like a shadow in the corner of his mind. The clock on the dashboard read 2:15 a.m., and the further he drove, the more the tension seemed to build. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, convinced that the figure from the sedan was somehow following him. After a few minutes, he felt the car lurch suddenly, and the engine gave a sputtering cough. Ethan gripped the steering wheel as the car began to slow, despite his foot being on the accelerator. His heart sank. Not now. With a sinking feeling, he realized that he wasn't going to make it very far. The car sputtered again, and the headlights began to flicker. Then the engine died. Ethan tried restarting it, but the car refused to respond. The desolate highway stretched before him, and panic set in as he realized he was once again stranded. His pulse hammered in his ears as he sat there, trapped. The cold air outside seeped in through the cracked window. He stared out into the pitch-black darkness, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in his car. He should have been terrified, but instead, a strange calm settled over him. And then, in the distance, he saw the headlights of another vehicle. The car was coming fast, and in an instant, it was right beside him, passing him on the road. But as the vehicle sped past, Ethan's heart stopped. Through the windshield, he could see the figure, the same person from the sedan, now driving the car that had passed him. They didn't look at him. They didn't acknowledge him at all. They simply kept driving, moving further and further down the highway, disappearing into the night. Ethan sat frozen, unable to move. The car that had just passed him was gone, and the desert was empty again. He took a deep breath and tried starting the engine again. This time it worked, but the sense of unease, of something being horribly wrong, never left him. He drove the rest of the way home, not daring to stop or even look back. The next morning, Ethan tried to call the police to report what had happened, but they had no record of any strange activity on that stretch of road. No broken down cars, no missing persons, nothing. He tried calling his friends to tell them about the eerie encounter, but nobody believed him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something had followed him that night. Something that was no longer human. And to this day, whenever Ethan drives through that stretch of highway again, he can't shake the feeling that the figure in the sedan is still out there, waiting for him, just beyond the dark horizon. Story 4, The Phantom Truck Driver. Tom had been driving long-haul trucks for over a decade, so he was no stranger to the lonely stretches of highway that crisscrossed the country. He had driven nearly every major highway in the United States, from the Mearsour 95 to the 40, but his least favorite route was U.S. Route 66. It wasn't just the long hours or the truck stops that smelled like stale coffee and diesel fumes. It was the stretch of highway that ran through Missouri, right near the town of Rolla. This particular evening, Tom was hauling a load of electronics across the country. He had been on the road for over 10 hours, and the fatigue was beginning to weigh heavily on him. His eyelids felt like they were glued shut, but he pushed through, knowing that if he could just make it to the next truck stop, he could rest for the night. Around 11:30 p.m., the highway was empty, the moonlight barely cutting through the thick clouds. His truck's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it felt like the darkness around him was closing. And the miles seemed to drag on, each stretch of road blending into the next, and Tom's mind started to wander. He had just passed through the small town of Rolla when something caught his eye. Off in the distance, he saw a pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, rapidly gaining on him. The sound of an engine grew louder, and before Tom could register what was happening, a truck passed him on the left side, so close that it shook his rig. Tom blinked in surprise. It was an 18-wheeler, just like his, but the driver didn't wave or signal as he passed. Nothing about the truck's movement seemed right. There was something unnatural about it, as if the driver wasn't paying attention at all. The truck swerved slightly, then straightened out, speeding ahead without slowing down. "That's strange," Tom muttered to himself, a sudden unease creeping up his spine. He had been driving long enough to know that drivers don't pass others like that unless they're in a hurry or trying to send a message. But what puzzled Tom the most was the truck's appearance. The rig was old, much older than any truck he had seen on the road in recent years. The paint was chipped and faded, and the headlights were an eerie shade of yellow, not the typical white light of modern trucks. Still, Tom tried to brush off the feeling and focused on the road ahead. He continued driving, but his thoughts were consumed with the strange encounter. The truck had disappeared into the distance, but it had left behind an uncomfortable feeling in its wake. It wasn't long before Tom saw the truck again, this time further down the highway. The headlights appeared in his rearview mirror once more, but this time, the truck was closer than before. It wasn't passing him, it was gaining on him, too quickly. Tom's pulse quickened. He glanced nervously at his speedometer, realizing that he hadn't been speeding. In fact, he was driving well below the limit, doing everything right to avoid accidents. But the truck behind him wasn't slowing down. It was as if it was deliberately tailing him, closing in with every second. Tom's anxiety turned to panic. He had heard about phantom trucks, rumors about drivers encountering strange vehicles that didn't behave like normal trucks, as if they were ghosts of the highway. He had always dismissed them as urban legends, but now as the eerie truck got closer, he wasn't so sure. He gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, and tried to focus on the road. The sound of the truck's engine roaring behind him was deafening, but Tom didn't dare look in his mirror again. He could feel the weight of the truck behind him, its presence suffocating him. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and the only thing that kept him from losing his mind was the thought of the next truck stop, just a few miles ahead. Tom pressed the accelerator, urging his truck to go faster, but the phantom truck stayed right on his tail, as if mocking him. It was faster than him, moving effortlessly despite the apparent age of the rig. His truck was a newer model, powerful and capable of high speeds, but the phantom truck was toying with him. It was so close now that Tom could feel the vibrations of the engine rattling his own vehicle. With each passing second, Tom's dread deepened. He couldn't understand what was happening. He wasn't imagining this. The truck was real. It was there, behind him, chasing him down the empty stretch of highway. Suddenly, without warning, the eerie truck swerved violently. It crossed into Tom's lane, coming dangerously close to his truck's front grille. The impact seemed imminent, but just before it hit, the phantom truck veered back into its lane and sped away into the night, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust in its wake. Tom's heart was racing. His hands shook as he slowed his truck down, trying to regain control of his breathing. He didn't know whether to laugh at how absurd the situation felt or scream in terror at what had just happened. For a moment, he thought about pulling over and calling for help, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom truck would be waiting for him if he did. Instead, he continued driving. The truck stopped, growing ever closer. But it seemed that the phantom truck wasn't finished with him yet. Every time Tom thought he had shaken it off, it appeared again in his rearview mirror, moving faster and faster, as if it was drawing him deeper into the darkness. It wasn't until he finally reached the truck stop that the presence behind him disappeared. He pulled into the lot, parked his truck, and rushed inside, his heart still pounding in his chest. He was shaking uncontrollably, but his instincts told him to call it a night, to not go back out on that road. Tom asked the clerk inside the truck stop if they had any information about strange truck drivers passing through the area. The clerk looked at him with a confused expression, as if he hadn't heard of anything like that. But when Tom mentioned the phantom truck's strange vintage appearance, the clerk went pale. "Sounds like the ghost truck," the clerk said in a low voice, his eyes darting around nervously. "I've heard the stories about it. Some say it's the ghost of a truck driver who died in an accident on that stretch of road years ago. They say his truck still haunts the highway, chasing down any driver foolish enough to pass through." Tom stared at him, too stunned to respond. He had heard the rumors. Before, stories of ghosts and strange happenings on the highway. But now, standing in the truck stop, he wasn't so sure if it was just a story anymore. The encounter had felt far too real. When he finally settled into his truck and shut the door behind him, Tom tried to push the thoughts of the phantom truck out of his mind. But as he lay there, eyes wide open, unable to sleep, he could still feel the weight of the truck behind him, haunting him in the darkness of the night. And to this day, whenever Tom drives on that stretch of US Route 66, he can't help but glance nervously in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the same phantom truck following him again, just waiting for him to make a mistake. Story 5. The Woman on the Side of the Road. It was a humid summer night in North Carolina, and Sarah was just finishing her shift at a local diner. The clock read 11:45 p.m. as she grabbed her purse and jacket, ready to drive home. She had been working all day, and all she wanted was to get back to her apartment, kick off her shoes, and relax with a good book. She wasn't looking for adventure, she was just exhausted. Her route home took her down Highway 17, a long, dark stretch of road that wound through the countryside. The highway was notorious for its lack of streetlights, which made the drive feel especially eerie in the dead of night. But Sarah had taken this route so many times that she had grown used to it. It was familiar, comfortable, until tonight. As Sarah cruised along the road, she felt the weight of the day's exhaustion pressing against her, and the rhythmic hum of her car's tires on the asphalt made her feel drowsy. She rolled down the window slightly, hoping the cool night air would wake her up, but it didn't help much. Her eyelids were heavy, and her mind was wandering, filled with thoughts of home and sleep. That's when she saw her. At first, Sarah thought it was a mirage, her mind playing tricks on her, but as she got closer, she saw her clearly. A woman standing alone by the side of the road. She was wearing a long white dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in a Victorian-era painting. Her hair was long and dark, and she seemed to be staring out into the darkness, unmoving. Sarah's first thought was that the woman must be lost. Maybe her car had broken down, or maybe she was stranded. But something about her appearance unsettled Sarah. She was just standing there, alone in the middle of nowhere. Sarah slowed, her car down as she approached, her mind racing with questions. Should she stop? Was the woman in trouble? But then, something strange happened. As Sarah passed her, the woman's head turned slowly, locking eyes with her. Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. The woman's eyes were empty, dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through Sarah's car. It only lasted for a moment, but it was enough to send a wave of unease through Sarah. She quickly sped up, not daring to look back. But as she drove further down the road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and she couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. The woman was still standing there, watching her. Sarah shook her head, trying to convince herself it was nothing. She had just seen a woman standing by the side of the road. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But then, something even stranger occurred. As she approached the next bend in the road, she saw the woman again, this time further up the road. She was standing at the edge of the highway, just like before. But how could that be? Sarah had just passed her a few minutes ago. How could the woman have gotten so far ahead so quickly? She felt a knot form in her stomach as she slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop in the middle of the road. The woman wasn't moving. She just stood there, staring at Sarah as she pulled up. "Are you okay?" Sarah called out the window, her voice trembling. She had to know what was going on. The woman didn't reply, just continued to stare at Sarah with those dark, hollow eyes. It was as if she didn't even hear her. The silence between them felt suffocating. Sarah's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Suddenly, the woman took a slow step forward, and then another. "Wait," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you okay?" The woman didn't answer. She just kept walking toward Sarah's car, her eyes fixed on her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the woman got closer, too close. The cold air outside the car seemed to creep in through the open window, and Sarah could feel her skin prickle with goosebumps. In a sudden burst of panic, Sarah threw the car into reverse, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. Her tires screeched as she sped backward down the highway, the woman still standing there, watching her. Sarah's hands were shaking, her mind screaming at her to get out of there. But she couldn't stop herself. The car jerked as she threw it into drive, accelerating down the road. She didn't look back. It wasn't until she reached the next town, some 15 miles down the road, that Sarah allowed herself to slow down. Her heart was still pounding, her breath ragged. She glanced around, half expecting to see the woman following her, but there was nothing. No sign of the woman, no movement in the darkness, just empty, quiet roads. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What had she seen? Who was that woman? Why had she been standing there watching her? The rest of the drive was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Sarah didn't speak to anyone when she got home, and she tried to put the strange encounter out of her mind. But the image of the woman's eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, kept returning to her no matter how hard she tried to forget. The next morning, as Sarah was drinking her coffee, she told herself it had been nothing more than a trick of the light, an illusion brought on by fatigue. She had driven alone for hours after all. But when she scrolled through her phone to check the news, something made her pause. A small article caught her eye about a woman who had gone missing from a nearby town, just a few miles from where Sarah had encountered the strange figure on the road. The woman's body had never been found, but the police suspected foul play. The last time she was seen, she had been standing on the side of the road, much like the woman Sarah had seen. Sarah's blood ran cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that what she had encountered was no ordinary hitchhiker or lost traveler. Whatever had happened on that stretch of Highway 17 that night, it wasn't just a random encounter. There was something darker at play, something that would follow Sarah for a long time. And to this day, whenever she drives down that road, she can't help but remember the woman in the white dress and wonder if the phantom had ever truly left her behind. Story 6, The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was a late October evening, the kind of night where the air felt heavy and damp, and the darkness of the road seemed to swallow everything whole. Mike had just finished a long day at a construction site in Philadelphia and was heading back home to Pittsburgh. He was used to long drives, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the day, or maybe it was the unusually thick fog that seemed to creep along the highway, hugging the road like a blanket. Mike had seen the headlights of other cars passing him, but they seemed few and far between. His own headlights barely cut through the fog, making the road ahead feel like a vast, empty abyss. As he drove along Interstate 80, Mike found himself yawning, his eyelids heavy from exhaustion. He had been on the road for over 2 hours now, and his body was pleading for a rest. But there was no rest stop for miles, so he kept driving, hoping to make it to the next town. Then, as if out of nowhere, he saw her. A woman standing alone on the shoulder of the highway. At first, Mike thought it was a mirage, the kind of trick the mind plays when you've been driving too long. But as he got closer, he could see her clearly. Tall, thin, and wearing a light jacket, her long hair billowing in the wind. She was standing by the side of the road, looking out into the dark. There was something about her posture that seemed strange, too still, almost lifeless. Mike's heart skipped a beat as he drove closer, the eerie quiet of the night making the whole situation feel unsettling. Mike wasn't the type to stop for hitchhikers. His father had always warned him about the dangers of picking up strangers, but something about this woman made him hesitate. She wasn't waving for help or trying to flag him down. She was just standing there, as if waiting for something, or someone. He slowed his truck, rolling down the window slightly, and called out to her. "Hey, you, need a ride?" The woman turned her head toward him, and that's when he saw her face. Her eyes were dark, almost hollow, and there was an unsettling emptiness in them that made Mike's skin crawl. She said nothing, but her gaze seemed to penetrate him, like she was looking right through him. "Are you okay?" Mike asked again, his voice a little shakier than he intended. Still no answer. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Mike's stomach twisted with unease. Something wasn't right. Despite the feeling gnawing at him, he couldn't bring himself to drive away. He felt a strange pull to help her, even if it made no sense. He opened the door and stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. "Come on, you need to get off the road," he said gently, his voice trying to mask the concern bubbling up inside him. The woman remained silent as she slowly walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. As she got closer, Mike's nerves intensified. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the fog thicker. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, but he pushed through it. He had to help her. This wasn't normal. She stopped just a few feet away, and for a moment, Mike couldn't look away from her eyes. They were dark, like black holes, pulling him in, drowning him. And that's when he noticed it, the faint smell of something sour, something rotten coming from her. It was almost as if she hadn't bathed in days, maybe longer. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her clothes, nothing like what you would expect someone to wear in the middle of October, were too light for the chill of the night. Without thinking, Mike took a step forward. "Do you need some water?" he asked, his voice trembling. But before she could answer, something strange happened. The woman tilted her head to the side as if she were listening to something far away. Her eyes flickered toward the foggy road behind Mike, and for the briefest moment, Mike thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her expression. And then, without a word, she turned and began to walk away, back toward the woods that bordered the highway. Mike was left standing there, dumbfounded. What was going on? Why hadn't she said anything? He blinked, trying to shake the fog from his mind. But when he turned to look down the road, she was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the mist. "Hey!" Mike called out, running toward the woods. But there was no sign of her. No trace. He walked along the shoulder, scanning the darkness, but nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all. Mike's heart raced as he returned to his truck, the sensation of unease pressing heavily on him. He tried to dismiss the strange encounter, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the image of the woman, her hollow eyes, her unsettling silence, stayed with him, haunting him. He didn't see another car on the road for the next hour, but that didn't bring him any comfort. It only made the silence louder. By the time he reached the next exit and finally pulled into a small truck stop, Mike's nerves were completely shot. He pulled up to a dimly lit gas pump and went inside to grab some coffee. The cashier behind the counter looked up at him as he walked in. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and as she glanced at him, her expression shifted slightly, almost like she recognized him from somewhere. "Long night?" she asked. Mike nodded. "Yeah, you could say that." She paused for a moment, then spoke again. "You saw her, didn't you?" Mike froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What?" The woman sighed and leaned in slightly. "You're not the first. She's been seen by drivers on this road for years. Same thing every time. Just standing there by the side of the road, waiting, and every time she disappears before anyone can help her." Mike's mind spun. "Who is she?" The woman's eyes darkened. "Some say she's the ghost of a woman who died on this stretch of road. Some say she's waiting for someone, but no one knows for sure. All I know is that you shouldn't stop for her. Just keep driving no matter what." Mike stared at her, his mind racing. He had seen something. Something he couldn't explain. It wasn't a trick of the light or his imagination. She was real, at least in some sense. After paying for his coffee, Mike left the store, but the strange encounter stayed with him for the rest of the night. He drove the remaining miles in a daze, constantly checking his rear view mirror, half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road again. To this day, whenever Mike drives down I-80, he remembers the woman in the white jacket, standing alone in the fog, and wonders if she's still out there, waiting for the next driver to stop, the next person who might unknowingly become a part of her haunting story. Story 7. The Highway Phantom. Rick had been driving down the legendary Route 66 for more than a decade. As a long-haul trucker, he'd seen it all. The wide-open roads, the endless stretches of desert, the occasional unexpected traffic jam, and of course, the strange things that always seemed to happen at night. He was used to the lonely roads, the quiet solitude of driving long hours, especially through the midnight shift when the world seemed to sleep and the highway felt like it was his and his alone. But that night, something felt different. Maybe it was the thick fog that had rolled in suddenly, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Or perhaps it was the eerie stillness of the night, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Whatever it was, Rick couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him as he cruised along Route 66 in his 18-wheeler, headed toward a delivery in Santa Fe. The radio had gone dead an hour ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the soft hum of the truck's engine. Rick wasn't scared of the dark. He'd spent enough time on the road to know that the night was just part of the job. Still, there was something unsettling about the way the road seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead to nowhere. Around 2 a.m., Rick passed through a small, forgotten stretch of road, a place he didn't remember ever seeing before. There were no signs, no lights, just a wide, empty highway flanked by dry, barren land. He felt a strange pull to slow down, almost as if the road itself was beckoning him to stop. But he pressed on, the miles ticking, by trying to ignore the increasing chill creeping into the truck's cab. As he approached a bend in the road, Rick noticed something odd up ahead. A figure, a person, standing alone on the shoulder of the highway. He squinted through the fog, wondering if it was a mirage. But as he got closer, the figure became clearer. A man wearing a long, dark coat, standing perfectly still, facing away from the road. Rick felt a chill run down his spine. Who would be standing out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? His first instinct was to drive past, not to engage with a stranger on such an isolated road. But something about the figure felt wrong. There was an odd stillness to him, like he wasn't moving at all, not even breathing. Rick felt his heart beat faster as he slowed the truck down, trying to make out more details. Was the man hurt? Had he broken down and was in need of help? When Rick's truck came to a stop just a few feet away from the figure, the man slowly turned toward him as if he'd been waiting for Rick to stop all along. His face was pale, almost unnaturally so, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight into Rick's own. "Are you okay?" Rick asked, his voice sounding small in the dead silence of the night. The man said nothing. He just stood there staring. His coat seemed to ripple in the wind, although there was no breeze. Rick waited for the man to speak, but when he didn't, Rick's unease grew. Something was off. The way the man stood there, unmoving like a statue, something about it made Rick feel like he shouldn't be there. Without thinking, Rick slammed the truck into reverse, the tires screeching as he pulled back onto the highway. He didn't care if it was rude. He didn't care if he looked foolish. He just needed to get away from that man. As he accelerated down the road, his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the further he drove, the more unsettled he became. He glanced in his rearview mirror. Nothing. No figure. No man. It was as if the person had never been there at all, vanished into thin air. Rick shook his head, his pulse still hammering in his chest. It wasn't until the next town that Rick finally felt a sense of calm. He stopped at a small gas station to grab some coffee and refuel. The night clerk, an older man with a gruff voice, noticed Rick's nervous demeanor and asked him if everything was okay. "Yeah, just a little shaken up," Rick said as he ran his hand through his hair trying to calm his nerves. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Did you pass that old stretch of road near the old gas station back there?" Rick nodded, still trying to shake the image of the man's empty eyes from his mind. "Yeah, I did. I saw this guy standing on the side of the road, just standing there staring at me. It freaked me out." The clerk's face hardened. "You saw him, huh?" The phantom of Route 66, he muttered. Rick frowned. What do you mean? The clerk sighed and leaned in closer. It's an old legend around here. Every trucker who drives that stretch has seen him at least once. Some say he's a hitchhiker who died on that road years ago. Others say he's a ghost, just waiting for someone to pick him up. The thing is, if you stop for him, you'll never see him again. You'll be left wondering if he was even there at all. Rick's blood ran cold. The phantom. It made sense. He hadn't just imagined it. He had seen the man, or whatever he was, standing on the side of the road, staring at him with those hollow eyes. I didn't stop for him, Rick said quietly, more to reassure himself than to anyone else. The clerk nodded. Good choice. No one who's ever stopped for him has come back to talk about it. You were lucky. Rick didn't stay much longer. He grabbed his coffee, paid for his fuel, and climbed back into his truck. But as he pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. That phantom. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like the highway itself was haunted, like it had a will of its own. As the truck sped down Route 66, Rick glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time he didn't expect to see the figure. He didn't want to see the figure. But somehow he knew that the phantom of Route 66 would always be out there, waiting for the next traveler to pass by. And one day, someone else would stop, and that someone might never come back. Story 8. The Blood-Stained Road. Jake had always been the type to appreciate a quiet, uneventful drive. The long stretches of road, the hum of the engine, the peaceful quiet, there was something therapeutic about it. It was a Sunday evening when Jake, a 29-year-old mechanic, found himself heading home from a job in a small town off U.S. Route 101 in Oregon. The skies were overcast, and a light drizzle had started to fall. The kind of weather that made the highway seem even more desolate than it usually was. He had driven this stretch of road many times before, but tonight there was something about the fog that clung to the road that made it feel different. Jake had finished a long, grueling day working on a truck that seemed to have more issues than he had patience for. He was ready to go home, put his feet up, and grab a cold beer. The highway was quiet, and the only sound he could hear was the rhythm of his tires on the wet pavement, the windshield wipers working in sync with the drizzle. As he drove, Jake's mind wandered. He thought about the week ahead, the repair shop, and maybe spending some time in the garage tinkering with an old car he had been restoring. It wasn't until he reached a particularly quiet stretch of road that he saw it, something out of the corner of his eye. At first, Jake didn't register it. He was too deep in thought, but as he passed by, something about the scene caught his attention. He looked over to the side of the road. There, just beyond the guardrail, was what appeared to be a small, dilapidated house. The lights were off, but there was something odd about it. It was almost too quiet. It didn't seem like the kind of place anyone would want to live, let alone linger near. Jake frowned, shaking his head. Must be tired, he muttered to himself, trying to shake the odd feeling that had come over him. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but as he glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart stopped. A figure was standing on the side of the road, just outside the house he had seen earlier. A man, but not just any man. He was standing unnaturally still, almost as if frozen in time. Jake's heart raced as he looked back at the man, who seemed to be staring directly at him. He had seen enough to know that there was something wrong with the situation, but he didn't want to overreact. It wasn't uncommon for people to be out and about on a quiet road, especially if they were having car trouble or walking home from somewhere. But as he approached the spot where the man stood, something made him slow down, and a cold feeling washed over him. The man was dressed in a ragged, torn coat, and his clothes were covered in what appeared to be blood. The fabric was dark red, clinging to his arms as he stood motionless. Jake's stomach twisted. He should have kept driving, but something inside him told him to stop. Jake pulled over to the shoulder, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel. He reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment. His instincts told him this wasn't just some hitchhiker or someone stranded on the road. This was something different, something darker. "Hey, you all right?" Jake called out, his voice barely breaking the silence. The man didn't respond. He just stood there staring blankly ahead, his eyes dark and hollow. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Hey man, do you need help?" Still no response. He stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at his skin. He approached the man cautiously, keeping a safe distance. The bloodstains on his clothes were unmistakable, the way the dark red soaked into the fabric, leaving an eerie trail of color that stretched all the way down to the man's hands. "Hey!" Jake called out again, his voice more firm now. "Are you hurt?" It wasn't until Jake was a few feet away that the man slowly turned his head, and in that moment, Jake's blood ran cold. The man's face was pale, his skin drawn tight over his features. His eyes were wide, bulging out like he had seen something terrifying, something that had left him in a state of permanent horror. But it wasn't just the man's expression that terrified Jake. It was the blood. There was so much of it, dripping from the man's hands, his clothes, and even his face. It was as if the man had been covered in it, as if he had been in a violent struggle or worse. "Help! Me!" the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake froze. There was something deeply wrong here. His mind screamed at him to run, to get back in the truck and drive as fast as he could. But he couldn't move. His legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the spot. Before he could react, the man took a step toward him. That was when Jake saw it, a glint in the man's eye, a flash of recognition. But it wasn't the kind of recognition that made Jake feel better. No, it was something far darker. The man's eyes were full of fear and desperation, but there was something else there too. Something that made Jake's heart skip a beat. The man reached out, his bloodied hand stretched toward Jake. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice shaking. Jake didn't wait to hear more. He bolted for his truck, his heart pounding in his chest as he jumped inside. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the rearview mirror, watching as the man stood motionless by the side of the road, still staring at him with that hollow, empty gaze. With a shaking hand, Jake started the truck, throwing it into drive and speeding away down the highway. He didn't look back, not even once. It wasn't until the next morning that Jake learned the truth. He stopped for breakfast at a small diner in the next town, and as he sat at the counter, he overheard a conversation between two older men sitting nearby. They were talking about an accident that had happened on the highway the night before. A car had crashed just a few miles from where Jake had seen the man, and when the police arrived, they found a gruesome scene. The driver of the car had been covered in blood, his own blood from a fatal wound, and the police had discovered a trail of blood leading off into the nearby woods. Jake froze. He had seen the man. He had seen the blood. But it wasn't the same blood. The man he had encountered had been drenched in it, not just a little bit of it, and the look in the man's eyes. It was as if he knew something about that place, about that road. Jake's mind raced. What had he seen? Had he encountered the ghost of someone who had died in the crash? Or was it something else? Something worse? Whatever it was, Jake knew one thing for sure. He would never drive down that stretch of highway again. Not in the dark, and certainly not with that haunting figure waiting for the next driver to stop. Story 9. The Truck Stop Horror. Ben had been on the road for nearly 2 decades, traveling across the vast stretches of America's highways, hauling freight from one coast to another. The road had always been his home, and he was used to the isolation. The hum of his truck's engine, the steady rhythm of the tires on the pavement, these sounds had become his constant companions. He was used to the late-night drives, the quiet rest stops, and the occasional strange encounter. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that night on Interstate 40 in the middle of the New Mexico desert. It was 2:30 a.m., and Ben was already exhausted. His eyes burned from the long hours behind the wheel, and the constant monotony of the road was starting to get to him. The night was pitch black, and the only light came from his headlights, illuminating the endless stretch of highway ahead. He had been driving for hours without stopping, and though he knew he should take a break, he wanted to make good time. Ben decided to pull into the next truck stop he saw, hoping to grab a quick cup of coffee to keep him going for the rest of the night. As he slowed his truck and pulled into the parking lot, he noticed that the place seemed eerily empty. There were a few trucks parked in the lot, but none of them were running. The place had an almost abandoned feel, and Ben couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that was creeping up his spine. He parked his truck and stepped out, stretching his stiff legs. The wind was cold and biting, and the air smelled of dust and diesel. The truck stop was small, with a few dimly lit lamps casting long shadows. Across the lot, there was no one inside, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind and the occasional squeak of the metal sign swinging overhead. Ben walked toward the entrance of the diner, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he approached the door, he noticed a woman standing by the window. She was tall, with long black hair that hung in loose waves. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and she was staring out into the darkness, her expression distant and vacant. Ben paused, unsure whether to enter. Something about the woman's presence felt wrong, but needing the caffeine, he shook off the feeling and opened the door. Inside, the diner was just as empty as the parking lot. The neon lights flickered above him, casting a sickly green hue over everything. A few booths were scattered around the room, but they were all vacant. The counter was empty, save for one waitress standing behind it. She had a tired, drawn look on her face, as if she hadn't slept in days. Ben took a seat at the counter, trying to ignore the unease building in his chest. He ordered a coffee and tried to make small talk with the waitress, but she barely acknowledged him. Her eyes kept darting to the window, as if she were waiting for something or someone. Ben turned his attention back to the woman outside, still standing motionless by the window. He couldn't help but stare at her figure framed against the darkness of the desert. After a few moments, the waitress brought him his coffee, but she didn't say a word. Ben took the cup, but his stomach twisted as he took a sip. The coffee was lukewarm, and it tasted bitter. He set the cup down, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him. That's when he heard it, the softest sound, like a low whisper coming from the other side of the diner. Ben turned his head, but there was no one there. The waitress was still behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the window. Suddenly, the woman outside turned her head, locking eyes with Ben through the glass. Her stare was intense, unnerving. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, predatory, like she knew something Ben didn't. He felt his heart race, his palms beginning to sweat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Without thinking, Ben stood up from his seat and walked toward the door. The woman continued to smile, her lips curling in a way that made Ben's stomach churn. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. But the woman wasn't standing at the window anymore. She was gone. Ben felt a momentary sense of relief. He made his way back to his truck, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, the low rumble of the truck a comforting sound. He pulled out of the lot, his headlights cutting through the darkness of the desert. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the parking lot, watching him leave. But the truck stop was empty, just as it had been when he first arrived. Ben drove for another hour before he began to feel like he was finally getting back to normal. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The same woman. She was standing by the side of the highway, her figure illuminated by the truck's headlights. Ben slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled over to the side of the road, trying to catch his breath. The woman stood there staring at him, unmoving. She was dressed in the same black coat, her hair flowing in the wind. But this time, there was something different about her. Her eyes were black, soulless, like deep voids that swallowed everything in their path. Ben tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the longer he stared at her, the more real she became. She raised her hand slowly, pointing directly at him. Without thinking, Ben slammed the truck into drive and sped off, his tires screeching as he pulled away. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, almost 50 miles down the road. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Ben barely remembered the rest of the drive, his mind fogged by exhaustion and fear. When he finally reached a gas station, he pulled over, his hands trembling as he climbed out of the truck. He walked into the small convenience store, his eyes scanning the shelves for something to calm his nerves. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, gave him a curious look. "You look like you've seen a ghost, man." Ben didn't say anything. He just paid for his coffee and left, feeling the weight of the night press down on him. That was the last time Ben ever saw the woman. He never stopped at that truck stop again, and he never spoke of what happened to anyone. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the highway stretches endlessly before him, Ben still feels her eyes on him, following him wherever he goes. He's never been able to explain it, whether it was just his mind playing tricks on him or something more sinister. But he knows one thing for sure: some things on the highway are better left unexplained. Story 10. The Mysterious Passenger. Lucas had been driving trucks for over 5 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and it kept him on the road, which was exactly where he wanted to be. The open road had always given him a sense of freedom, an escape from the constant noise of the world. He was used to the lonely nights on Highway 54, Texas, where the horizon stretched endlessly in front of him, and the only company he had was the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional radio station that flickered in and out of range. It was a late night when the incident occurred. Lucas had just left a small town in West Texas, heading east toward his next delivery. He'd been on the road for hours, and the only thing he could think about was the long stretch of highway that lay ahead of him. The sky was a dull gray, and the thick clouds hung low, blocking out the stars. The air inside the truck was stale, the only light coming from the truck's dashboard and the occasional flash of his headlights. Around 11:30 p.m., as Lucas was driving through an isolated stretch of highway, he saw something strange out of the corner of his eye. There, on the side of the road, stood a figure. At first, he thought it was just a hitchhiker, but there was something about the way the figure was standing that made him uneasy. The person stood motionless, facing the road, not moving at all. His headlights illuminated the figure, and Lucas could see that the person was wearing a long, dark coat, the collar turned up against the cold. His face was shadowed, but there was a faint glow around him from the truck's lights. Lucas hesitated. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers, especially not at this hour in such a desolate area. But something about the figure made him slow down. It wasn't that he felt sorry for the person. It was just a gut feeling, something deep inside that told him to stop. So he did. Lucas pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching under the tires as he slowed to a stop. He rolled down the window, and before he could say anything, the figure was already walking toward him. The man's steps were slow but deliberate, and Lucas noticed that he was dragging one of his legs slightly, as if he were injured. When the man reached the window, he stopped and looked directly at Lucas. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, and his skin had a pale, almost sickly hue. His eyes, though, were what unnerved Lucas the most. They were a piercing, cold blue, but they lacked any emotion. There was no warmth, no humanity in them, just emptiness. "You need a ride?" Lucas asked, trying to mask the unease in his voice. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, please," he said in a hoarse voice that sent a chill through Lucas. Lucas wasn't sure what made him do it, but he unlocked the passenger door. The man didn't say a word as he climbed into the truck and sat down silently. Lucas couldn't help but notice that the man's clothes were torn in several places, and there was an odd smell about him, like old leather mixed with something metallic. The truck pulled back onto the highway, the engine humming steadily as Lucas tried to focus on the road ahead. The silence in the truck was oppressive. The man didn't say anything for several minutes, and Lucas couldn't bring himself to ask him where he was going. The feeling of discomfort in the air was palpable, as if something was wrong, but Lucas couldn't quite place it. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke. "Do you know what happened here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "The road," the man said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the accidents, the disappearances." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" But before the man could answer, Lucas noticed something out of the corner of his eye. In the rearview mirror, the highway behind him was completely empty. No cars, no lights, just an endless stretch of road, swallowed up by the darkness. That didn't seem right. The truck stop he had passed not even 20 miles back should have had at least a few cars. Yet there was nothing. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Lucas's chest, like someone had driven a needle straight into his heart. He gasped for breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter as the pain intensified. The road ahead seemed to blur, the lights of the truck flickering in and out. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice strangely calm, even though Lucas was clearly struggling to breathe. I don't know," Lucas gasped. "I feel strange." The pain worsened, and before Lucas could even react, he felt himself start to lose control of the truck. His vision blurred, and everything around him seemed to spin. "Stay with me," the man whispered, his voice eerily soft. "You're almost there." With one last burst of strength, Lucas slammed his foot onto the brake, but it was too late. The truck careened off the road, crashing into the ditch. The impact was brutal, and everything went black. When Lucas regained consciousness, he was lying in the ditch. The truck flipped on its side. His head ached, and his body felt heavy, as though he had been asleep for hours. He looked around, disoriented, but the man was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Lucas tried to climb out of the truck, but his body wouldn't respond. His hands were shaking, his heart racing. Slowly, he pulled himself out of the wreckage and stumbled into the road. As he looked down the highway, he saw it again. The same desolate stretch, no cars, no signs of life. It was as if the world around him had gone completely silent. But there in the distance, standing on the side of the road, was the man. He was facing away from Lucas, staring out into the darkness. This time, his coat was torn, and there was blood on his hands. Lucas didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he sprinted down the highway, not daring to look back. The man didn't move, didn't chase him, but Lucas could feel his presence lingering, like a shadow following him wherever he went. By the time Lucas reached the nearest town, the sun was rising. He collapsed in a diner, shaking and covered in dirt and sweat. The waitress called an ambulance, but when the paramedics arrived, they found nothing. No truck, no sign of an accident, and no trace of the man. It was as if everything had vanished, erased from existence. Lucas had never been able to explain what had happened that night. But one thing was certain. He would never drive down that stretch of Highway 54 again. He couldn't. Not after what he had seen, and not after the man in the passenger seat had disappeared without a trace. Story 11. The Highway. Phantom. Claire had always loved the open road. A free spirit by nature, she found solace in the vast, stretching highways of America, where the scenery was always changing and the sense of freedom was palpable. At 34, she had decided to take a solo road trip along Route 66, the historic route that had always fascinated her. Claire had done her research and planned everything down to the last detail: places to stop, restaurants to try, and motels to sleep in. The road had a nostalgic charm, and she couldn't wait to explore every inch of it. Her trip had been uneventful until she reached Arizona, a state where the landscape shifted from arid deserts to picturesque canyons. It was late one night when Claire found herself driving through a particularly remote section of Route 66. Her car's headlights cut through the night, illuminating the barren desert around her. There wasn't much in the way of civilization for miles, just the occasional road sign, the distant mountains, and the infinite sky above her. She'd been driving for hours and was starting to feel the weight of fatigue pressing down on her. She glanced at her GPS, only 50 more miles to the next town. It was late, but she didn't want to stop just yet. The open road called to her, the thrill of being alone in the vast, lonely desert keeping her wide awake. That's when she noticed something strange. There, standing on the side of the road, was a man. At first, Claire thought he was just another hitchhiker. The man was tall and thin, wearing a long, dark jacket that almost blended in with the night around him. His face was pale, his features shadowed by the wide brim of his hat. As Claire slowed down, she wondered whether she should stop and offer him a ride. She had heard countless warnings about picking up hitchhikers, but this man's presence struck her as odd. He didn't look like he was asking for help. He just stood there, motionless, staring at the headlights. Her heart skipped a beat as she drove past, but something in her gut told her to stop. Her instincts had never let her down before, so she pressed the brakes and pulled over, her car coming to a stop a few feet ahead of him. She rolled down the window just a crack, trying to gauge the situation. "Do you need help?" she asked, her voice sounding shakier than she intended. The man didn't answer at first. He just continued to stare at her with an unsettling intensity, his eyes reflecting the headlights in an almost eerie way. Then finally he spoke. "I'm trying to get to the next town. It's just a few miles ahead, but I've been walking for a long time," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. Claire hesitated. There was something about him that made her uneasy, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She had driven for hours and was starting to feel isolated and lonely in the middle of nowhere. Maybe a little conversation would do her good. "Hop in," she said, unlocking the door. The man opened the passenger door slowly and slid into the seat, but he didn't say anything else. Claire felt the weight of his presence beside her as she continued driving down the dark road, the headlights casting long shadows on the desert landscape. She tried to make small talk, but the man remained silent. It was almost as if he wasn't interested in speaking at all, and the air in the car grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. As the miles passed, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The man didn't seem to notice her unease. Instead, he simply stared out the window, his hands folded in his lap. Every now and then, Claire would glance at him, but his face remained impassive, like he was in some trance. The way he sat there, unmoving, unnerved her more than she cared to admit. "Are you sure you're okay?" Claire asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "You don't need to worry about me." Claire swallowed hard, a chill running down her spine. There was something off about his tone, something that sent a shiver through her entire body. But she didn't want to seem rude, so she kept her eyes on the road, trying to push the feeling aside. It wasn't long before Claire noticed that they were nearing a stretch of highway she didn't recognize. The GPS hadn't mentioned anything about this detour. The road she was on now seemed even more remote, with no signs of civilization, no lights, nothing but the vast emptiness around them. She glanced at the rearview mirror, but there were no other cars behind them, just the endless stretch of dark highway. "How far is it to the next town?" Claire asked, her voice sounding more anxious now. The man didn't answer at first. He just continued to stare out the window, and the silence between them grew heavy. Claire's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Something was definitely wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said, his voice low and cold. Claire's heart skipped a beat, her grip tightening on the wheel. She glanced at him, her stomach churning. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man turned his head toward her, his cold, dark eyes locking onto hers. "You should have kept driving. You're not safe out here." Claire's mind raced as she processed his words. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice now shaking with fear. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand on the door handle. In that moment, Claire's mind screamed at her to get away from him, to get out of the car and drive as fast as she could. But before she could act, the man opened the door and stepped out into the night. Claire slammed on the brakes, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she looked in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the road, staring at her with that same unsettling expression. She couldn't see his face clearly in the mirror, but his silhouette was enough to make her blood run cold. His figure was moving closer, slowly but deliberately. Before she could react, the man vanished. Just like that. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. Vanished into thin air. Claire sat there, frozen in shock. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel, unable to make sense of what had just happened. The man had disappeared, completely disappeared, right in front of her eyes. Terrified, Claire floored the accelerator and sped away, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The darkness swallowed the road ahead, and she didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town. She pulled into a gas station, shaking uncontrollably. The attendant stared at her as she rushed into the station, her face pale and her voice shaky as she tried to explain what had happened. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized no one would believe her. How could they? The man had vanished into thin air, and there was no evidence of him ever being there at all. That night, Claire checked into a motel and tried to sleep, but the image of the man's cold eyes stayed with her. She had no explanation for what had happened, no rational explanation at all. But one thing was certain, she would never pick up another hitchhiker again, not on that desolate stretch of Route 66 or anywhere else. To this day, Claire still can't shake the memory of that night. The phantom figure who had appeared out of nowhere, the warning in his voice, and the terror that gripped her heart. It's a haunting she will never forget, no matter how far she drives.